Hi, today I'll be keeping you company by telling you a scary story about a married man who has an affair with a mysterious woman who refuses to share any personal details. After their first night together, he starts getting creepy messages from an unknown number, warning him that his secret won't stay hidden. You'll be shocked by the plot twist. Welcome to the Urban and Myth Scary Story Podcast, Episode 5, The Other Woman, Chapter 1, Whispers in the Dark. John sat in the dim light of his office, the remnants of a long workday fading into the night outside. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of papers and the soft hum of his computer. It was a typical evening, until it wasn't. His phone buzzed with a message that made him glance, but it wasn't his wife, Jane, like it usually was. It was someone else, someone who shouldn't be messaging him. Meet me tonight? The message was short, sweet, and dangerous. He hesitated for a moment, but something inside him, a temptation long buried beneath years of routine, urged him to respond. The woman had been a fleeting encounter, someone he met purely by chance at a bar during a business trip. She was intoxicating, mysterious. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. His thumb hovered over the screen, torn between guilt and curiosity. Jane had been distant lately. Their marriage had settled into a predictable rhythm, but that wasn't why he responded. It was the mystery of the woman, the allure of the unknown. So, he typed, "Where?" Later that night, as he drove to the dimly lit motel she had chosen, the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across his windshield. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal, as if he had stepped into another life, one where consequences didn't matter. He checked the time, 11:47 p.m., and wondered if he'd regret this. Yet regret wasn't enough to stop him. When he arrived, she was already there, waiting in the doorway, her face partially hidden by the darkness. She looked the same as she had that night. Beautiful, but with a strange sadness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. No words were exchanged. They simply went inside. Hours later, as John lay awake in the dim light of the motel room, he felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like a shadow hanging over him. He turned to look at the woman, but she was gone. The sheets were still warm where she had been, yet the room felt colder than ever. Then, his phone buzzed again. Secrets never stay hidden. The words chilled him, but he dismissed it as a prank, or maybe his own paranoia. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. Something that wouldn't be so easily undone. Chapter 2, Phantom Warnings. The morning light spilled into John's bedroom, casting a pale glow over his face. He stirred, groggy and unrested, the events of the previous night lingering like a bad taste in his mouth. He rolled over, his phone still gripped in his hand, the message staring back at him. Secrets never stay hidden. He blinked at the screen, the words unsettling in the harsh daylight. He hadn't told anyone about his encounter. No one knew, except the woman. A ghost of a smile flickered on his lips. It was probably her way of messing with him. But the more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. She hadn't struck him as the playful type, and her sudden disappearance last night. Had she even left? A soft creak echoed from the hallway, and for a moment, his breath caught. It was too early for Jane to be up. He forced himself to breathe, shaking off the unease that clung to him. It's just the house, he told himself. Houses make sounds. But then his phone buzzed again, jolting him. You know how this ends. His pulse quickened. This wasn't her. It couldn't be. The words were too cold, too detached, as if whoever was sending them knew more than he did. John sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He thumbed through his contacts, trying to find the number, but it was listed as unknown. His mind raced, desperate to figure out who could be sending these messages. His thoughts spiraled back to the woman, her dark eyes, her silence. He had asked nothing about her, not her name, her past, nothing. It was a mistake, a stupid, reckless mistake. He slid out of bed and padded to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. His reflection in the mirror seemed different, more hollow, as if something inside him had shifted overnight. He glanced over his shoulder, irrationally expecting to see her standing there. Nothing, just the empty hallway. But the feeling remained. As he walked through the house, he noticed the little things. Jane's coffee mug still untouched, her keys on the counter. Normally, she would have been bustling around by now. The house was too quiet, too still. His mind returned to the message. You know how this ends. What did that mean? He wasn't sure, but his stomach churned with a deep, gnawing sense of dread, as if somehow he already knew the answer. Later that afternoon, as he sat at his desk, the messages continued, each one more ominous than the last. His phone buzzed again. It's already begun. The words felt like ice in his veins. He tried to shake it off, but the tension had already wrapped itself around his chest, tightening with every passing minute. He looked up, startled, as Jane appeared in the doorway. You okay? You seem off. For a moment, he thought about telling her, about the messages, about the woman, about everything. But the words stuck in his throat. She wouldn't understand. Not this. I'm fine, he said, forcing a smile. Just tired. She looked at him, her gaze lingering a second too long, before nodding and leaving the room. As soon as she was gone, the phone buzzed once more. This time, the words sent a chill down his spine. She knows. Chapter 3. The Haunting Begins. John's grip tightened on his phone as he read the latest message. She knows. A suffocating dread settled over him, like the slow tightening of a noose. He glanced down the hallway where Jane had disappeared moments earlier. No, she couldn't know. He hadn't said a word. But the paranoia was creeping in, faster now. The rest of the day dragged by in a haze. The eerie messages stopped, but the silence was even worse. His mind kept circling back to that woman. Her face, her voice, her mysterious presence that night, and the way she vanished without a trace. He tried to shake off the unease gnawing at his gut, but it clung to him, thick and sticky. Later that evening, he found himself alone again in the dim light of his office. Jane was in the kitchen, busy with dinner, but the house felt cold, empty in a way it hadn't before. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. He stared at his phone, almost expecting it to light up again with another cryptic message. But it stayed dark, as if taunting him with the unknown. Just as he let out a breath, something moved in the corner of his eye. He froze, every muscle tensing. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. There, in the reflection, he saw her, the woman from that night, standing behind him, her pale face framed by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He whipped around, but the room was empty. He blinked, his breath coming in short gasps. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him, twisting his guilt into something tangible? Something sinister? He rubbed his eyes, trying to dispel the image, but the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling up his spine. Jane's voice broke the tension. John? Dinner's ready. He nearly jumped out of his skin, the sound so out of place in the oppressive quiet. He swallowed hard, nodding even though she couldn't see him. I'll be right there." The reflection of the woman haunted him as he joined Jane in the kitchen, her ghostly figure etched into the back of his mind. The meal passed in strained silence, the usual comfort of their routine now shattered by his secret. Every time Jane spoke, his stomach twisted with guilt, and each word felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the inevitable moment when everything would unravel. After dinner, he couldn't take it anymore. He excused himself, claiming a headache, and retreated to the bedroom. He needed to think, to get his head straight. But the moment he closed the door behind him, the air shifted. It felt heavy, oppressive, like something or someone was there with him. He didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to the mirror above the dresser. His reflection stared back, pale and anxious. And then, just behind him, she appeared again. Her eyes were darker this time, sunken and hollow, her skin a shade paler. She wasn't just a memory now. She was real as the guilt clawing at his insides. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. "You shouldn't have lied to her," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo that seeped into his bones. John's mouth went dry. What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her face inches from his. Her cold breath brushed against his neck as she spoke again, softer this time. "You know how this ends." The room spun, and John stumbled back, hitting the wall with a thud. When he looked up again, she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. But the weight of her presence still hung in the air, suffocating him. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The message glowed in the dim light. "You're already too late." Chapter 4. The Price of Betrayal. John could barely breathe as he stared at the phone. "You're already too late." The words seemed to echo inside his skull, a rhythmic pounding that wouldn't let go. His hands shook, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He was unraveling, his life crumbling piece by piece, and it all started with that night. That one mistake. He couldn't stay in the bedroom. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the shadows too thick, too deep. He stumbled into the hallway, trying to calm the thudding in his chest. Jane was still in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed dishes, completely unaware of the turmoil consuming him. The normalcy of it was almost unbearable. How long could he keep pretending everything was fine? The sound of water running faded into the background as John's mind replayed the ghost's words. "You know how this ends." But did he? He didn't even know what was happening, much less how it would end. He just knew that it was spiraling beyond his control. He made his way to the living room, sinking into the couch, his mind racing. His thoughts kept drifting back to the woman. Not the ghost. No, he hadn't realized she was a ghost until it was too late. But to that night when everything started. Her face, so beautiful and mysterious. The sadness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed until now. Who was she? What did she want from him? Suddenly, images flashed in his mind, vivid and sharp. He saw her, not in his house, but in another life, a different time. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was familiar, hauntingly so. He saw her standing in a dimly lit room, tears streaming down her face as she discovered the truth, her own husband's betrayal. The vision hit him like a freight train. He gasped, clutching the armrest of the couch as the scenes unfolded before him. Her husband, another woman, and the horrible moment when her world shattered. The grief, the rage that followed, and then the final image, her lifeless body, cold and still, the victim of her own broken heart. John shook his head, trying to rid himself of the images. but they clung to him. His chest tightened with fear. The woman had died after discovering her husband's infidelity. And now she was back to make sure he suffered the same fate. The pieces began to fall into place, and with each revelation, the horror deepened. This wasn't about guilt. This wasn't about him keeping his affair a secret. No, this was about revenge, her revenge. She was going to make sure his life ended in the same tragic way hers had. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His heart leaped into his throat, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. Just the faint rustle of the wind and the creeping sensation of being watched. He slammed the door shut, backing away, his pulse racing. The messages, the visions, the ghost, they were all leading him down the same path, a path that would end in betrayal and death. And the worst part? He couldn't escape it. It was already too late. Suddenly, Jane appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "John? What's going on? You've been acting strange all day." Her words barely registered as his mind swirled with fear. Should he tell her? Should he confess everything before it was too late? But he couldn't. He was too deep into this nightmare, and every instinct screamed that telling her would only make things worse. "I'm fine," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Just tired." Jane didn't look convinced, but she nodded, turning back to the kitchen. As she walked away, John felt a cold chill slide down his spine. Another buzz from his phone. "She's already suspicious. You know what happens next." John's stomach dropped. He knew. Oh, he knew all too well. Chapter 5. Consumed by Shadows. The tension between John and Jane thickened over the next few days, an unspoken dread hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Every glance, every silence between them felt loaded with suspicion. John could feel it. Jane knew something was wrong, even if she didn't say it. It was only a matter of time before she dug deeper, before everything came crashing down. And the messages hadn't stopped. They came in waves now, everyone more ominous than the last, driving him toward the edge of madness. "She's closer than you think. You can't hide forever." John had tried blocking the number, turning off his phone, even tossing it across the room in frustration. But the messages always found a way back. They were relentless, echoing in his mind long after the phone stopped buzzing. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the house, restless. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second reminding him how little time he had left. He wandered into the living room and froze. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were alive. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw her, the ghostly figure of the woman, standing there, motionless. Her skin was paler now, her features gaunt, almost skeletal. Her eyes, once so alluring, now burned with a dark, cold hatred. She was no longer the woman he had been drawn to. She was something far more terrifying, a shadow of death itself, fueled by vengeance. She didn't speak, but her presence screamed with menace. John stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold chill of fear wrapped around him. She was everywhere now, an ever-present reminder that his time was running out. He tried to speak, to ask what she wanted, but his throat was dry, the words trapped. All he could do was watch in horror as she slowly moved toward him, her steps deliberate, echoing like the ticking clock on the wall. Then, as if summoned by some unseen force, Jane appeared in the hallway. "John? What are you doing out here?" Her voice was laced with concern, but her eyes were full of suspicion. She glanced toward the corner where the ghost had been, but there was nothing there now. The shadows had swallowed her whole. John opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything that would make sense of this madness. But how could he explain? How could he tell her about the woman, this specter, that haunted him, pulling him toward the same fate that had claimed her? He couldn't. I couldn't sleep, he muttered, barely able to meet Jane's gaze. Just thinking. She watched him for a long moment, and in that silence the weight of his secrets pressed down on him like a vice. He could see it in her eyes. She knew. Not everything, but enough. "Come back to bed," Jane said softly, her tone gentle, but there was something else in her voice, something sharp, like the edge of a blade hidden in velvet. John nodded, following her back to the bedroom, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman, the ghost, was still watching, waiting. Her presence clung to him like a dark cloud, suffocating and relentless. As they lay in bed, the silence between them stretched out, heavy and tense. Jane's breathing was steady, but John couldn't relax. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over, trying to figure out how to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. He knew that now. Just as he closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Slowly, with dread creeping up his spine, he reached for it. The message was short, brutal, and final. "You'll betray her, just like I was betrayed." His heart lurched in his chest. He stared at the words, unable to look away. The ghost had made it clear. There was no way out. She was going to drive him toward the same end that had claimed her. Betrayal. Death. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if it would be his betrayal or Jane's. Chapter 5. Consumed by Shadows. The tension between John and Jane thickened over the next few days, an unspoken dread hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Every glance, every silence between them felt loaded with suspicion. John could feel it. Jane knew something was wrong, even if she didn't say it. It was only a matter of time before she dug deeper, before everything came crashing down. And the messages hadn't stopped. They came in waves now, everyone more ominous than the last, driving him toward the edge of madness. "She's closer than you think. You can't hide forever." John had tried blocking the number, turning off his phone, even tossing it across the room in frustration. But the messages always found a way back. They were relentless, echoing in his mind long after the phone stopped buzzing. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the house, restless. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second reminding him how little time he had left. He wandered into the living room and froze. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were alive. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw her, the ghostly figure of the woman, standing there, motionless. Her skin was paler now, her features gaunt, almost skeletal. Her eyes, once so alluring, now burned with a dark, cold hatred. She was no longer the woman he had been drawn to. She was something far more terrifying, a shadow of death itself, fueled by vengeance. She didn't speak, but her presence screamed with menace. John stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold chill of fear wrapped around him. She was everywhere now, an ever-present reminder that his time was running out. He tried to speak, to ask what she wanted, but his throat was dry, the words trapped. All he could do was watch in horror as she slowly moved toward him, her steps deliberate, echoing like the ticking clock on the wall. Then, as if summoned by some unseen force, Jane appeared in the hallway. "John? What are you doing out here?" Her voice was laced with concern, but her eyes were full of suspicion. She glanced toward the corner where the ghost had been, but there was nothing there now. The shadows had swallowed her whole. John opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything that would make sense of this madness. But how could he explain? How could he tell her about the woman, this specter, that haunted him, pulling him toward the same fate that had claimed her? He couldn't. "I couldn't sleep," he muttered, barely able to meet Jane's gaze. "Just thinking." She watched him for a long moment, and in that silence the weight of his secrets pressed down on him like a vice. He could see it in her eyes. She knew. Not everything, but enough. "Come back to bed," Jane said softly, her tone gentle, but there was something else in her voice, something sharp, like the edge of a blade hidden in velvet. John nodded, following her back to the bedroom, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman, the ghost, was still watching, waiting. Her presence clung to him like a dark cloud, suffocating and relentless. As they lay in bed, the silence between them stretched out, heavy and tense. Jane's breathing was steady, but John couldn't relax. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over, trying to figure out how to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. He knew that now. Just as he closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Slowly, with dread creeping up his spine, he reached for it. The message was short, brutal, and final. "You'll betray her, just like I was betrayed." His heart lurched in his chest. He stared at the words, unable to look away. The ghost had made it clear. There was no way out. She was going to drive him toward the same end that had claimed her. Betrayal. Death. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if it would be his betrayal or Jane's. Chapter 6. The Betrayer's End. John couldn't escape the cold grip of dread that tightened around him like a noose. The message on his phone, "You'll betray her, just like I was betrayed," kept repeating in his mind over and over, driving him to the edge. Every time he glanced at Jane, the weight of his secret felt unbearable. She didn't know everything, but the tension between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Days passed in a blur of anxiety. John barely slept, and when he did, the woman, the ghost, visited him in his dreams. Her presence grew more sinister with each night. Her figure decayed, her once beautiful face twisted with anger and sadness. She no longer needed words. Her mere existence was enough to torment him. She was consuming him, bit by bit, driving him toward the inevitable. One evening, after a long, silent dinner, Jane finally broke. "John, what's going on? You're not yourself. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a mixture of fear and anger. John could feel it, the moment he had dreaded, the moment where the truth would have to come out, or she would tear it out of him. His heart raced, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He could barely breathe, but before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Both of them jumped. The sound reverberated through the house like a warning, and John felt a chill seep into his bones. He knew who or what had caused it. Without a word, he stood and walked toward the noise. Jane followed closely, her confusion quickly turning to concern. As they entered the hallway, they found a shattered mirror on the floor, glass scattered everywhere. John froze, staring at the broken pieces. In one of the larger shards, he saw her. The woman, the ghost, stood in the reflection, her eyes dark and empty, her mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. But this time, It wasn't just him who saw her. Jane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took a step back. What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John's heart sank. She could see her. The barrier between their world and the ghosts had finally broken. "I should have told you," John murmured, his voice thick with regret. "But I didn't, and now it's too late." Jane looked at him, bewildered. "Told me what? What is going on, John?" He swallowed hard, the guilt and fear swirling inside him like a storm. "I had an affair," he admitted, the words heavy on his tongue. "With her." Jane's face paled as the pieces started to fall into place. She stared at the reflection, the woman's eerie form still visible in the broken glass. "But she's dead," John finished for her, "and she's here for revenge." The air around them grew colder, and the lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The ghost's presence filled the room, overwhelming, suffocating. Jane took a step closer to John, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror. "You betrayed her," Jane whispered, realization dawning on her. "And now she's going to do the same to us." Before John could respond, the ghost moved. She stepped out of the mirror, her figure becoming solid, tangible. Her expression was twisted with hatred, but behind it was something else, sorrow, deep and endless. "You know how this ends," she whispered, her voice a cold wind that sent shivers down John's spine. Suddenly, everything clicked. The ghost didn't just want to destroy him, she wanted him to understand, to feel the pain she had felt. Her betrayal, her tragic end, was mirrored in his own life. She wasn't just here to haunt him, she was here to make him live her fate. Jane's eyes were filled with tears, and in that moment, John realized the depth of his mistake. Not just the affair, but the lies, the deception. He had betrayed her, just as the ghost had been betrayed, and now it was all falling apart. The ghost moved closer, her presence overwhelming. John's pulse pounded in his ears as he realized there was no escape. He had set this in motion, and now it was too late to stop it. Jane reached out, grabbing his hand. "John, we can fix this. We can—" But before she could finish, the ghost was upon them. The air grew impossibly cold, and the lights flickered wildly. John could feel her presence closing in, suffocating, drowning him in darkness. He tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words never came. His vision blurred, the room spinning as the ghost's final words echoed in his mind. "You know how this ends." And just like that, the shadows consumed him. The next morning, Jane sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where John used to sit. The house was quiet, too quiet. She couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't fully comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded before her eyes. But one thing was certain, John was gone, and somewhere, in the distance, she could still feel the presence of the woman, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next betrayal.